It was 3 a.m., and the quiet of the night was broken by the shrill beep of the phone. The text message read, "We need to talk," and nothing more. Her heart pounded in her chest. His name flashed across the screen, and everything she had held onto was slipping away. In the months of waiting, the distance had already stretched too far. She'd endured long nights of loneliness, believing that love could survive the miles. Now this cryptic message felt like a betrayal. She gripped the phone tighter, staring at the words as they seemed to mock her. Was this the end of something that had once felt so right? The air was thick with uncertainty. The tears she hadn't let fall in months were now threatening to break free. How had it come to this? The silence between them had grown over the past few weeks, like an invisible wall she couldn't scale. And now this message, it was the final blow. She couldn't breathe. Not because she didn't know what was going on, but because she couldn't stop herself from hoping it wasn't as bad as it seemed. Her finger hovered over the screen, and for a split second she thought of calling him, but what was left to say? The coldness of his silence already spoke volumes. What if this was just another chapter of her waiting in vain? As the hours passed, the weight of the message clung to her. The phone lay silently on the bed, like a betrayal waiting to be felt. Her mind replayed the moments when everything had felt perfect, their late-night calls, the promises made despite the distance. But now, that same phone which had been a lifeline, had turned into an enemy. Her thoughts raced, spinning like a whirlwind of memories and questions. Why did he send that message? What did it even mean? The silence that followed seemed like the loudest noise she had ever heard. She thought about calling him, but she was unsure whether she was ready for whatever answer he might give. She had waited for so long, believing that distance was just a minor obstacle, something they could overcome. But now, it felt like she was on the edge of a cliff, and the fall seemed inevitable. Her heart ached with the realization that everything she had hoped for was now in question. The words "we need to talk" echoed in her mind, reverberating with every second of waiting. She had to know. But fear held her back, fear of hearing something she wasn't prepared for, fear of finally facing the truth that maybe, just maybe, love wasn't enough. She couldn't bring herself to sleep. Every minute felt like an hour, and the ticking of the clock was like a cruel reminder of time slipping away. Her mind kept returning to the text, the unanswered question hanging in the air. Her thoughts drifted to their last conversation, where he had sounded distant, almost distracted. Was it all leading up to this? Was she foolish to have ignored the signs? She had told herself to be patient, to trust the relationship, to trust him. But now, doubt crept in like a shadow, threatening to suffocate the fragile hope she had held onto for so long. The love she had felt was now tainted with insecurity. As the night dragged on, she found herself asking whether this was the beginning of the end. She glanced at the clock again. 4:30 a.m. The hours stretched out in front of her, filled with uncertainty. Her hand reached for the phone once more, but she stopped herself. She couldn't do it. Not yet. She needed answers, but what if the answers broke her even more? She took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart, knowing that something had changed forever. What was she holding on to now? It felt as though the entire world had gone silent. The buzz of daily life, the endless distractions, all faded into the background. Her phone was the only sound now, vibrating with every new message. Each buzz made her flinch. She had never felt so paralyzed by a single text message. She replayed their first meeting in her mind, the way he had smiled when he first saw her. He had been charming, warm, and for a while, everything seemed perfect. She had believed in him, in them. Now, she questioned everything. Their long-distance relationship had always been difficult, but there was a beauty in the quiet, in the waiting. They shared moments, stolen calls, secret plans, future promises. But now those moments felt hollow, and the distance between them seemed unbearable. The silence was louder than the words. She wondered if he had already moved on, or if this was just another test of their love. Was it a test she could pass, or was the answer already clear? The uncertainty felt suffocating, and yet there was no escaping it. All she could do was wait for the message that would change everything. The night stretched on, each passing minute slipping through her fingers like sand. Her phone lay in front of her, the screen still glowing faintly, yet she couldn't bring herself to touch it. Each time her fingers hovered over the screen, a wave of panic surged through her. The silence was deafening. She thought of all the little moments they had shared, all the promises that had made the distance feel bearable, and now it was all teetering on the edge of a single text message. She wondered if she had been foolish to hope for a love that could survive the miles. The doubts gnawed at her. Was it selfish to want someone so far away? She reached for her phone once more, but just before she tapped the screen, a single thought stopped her cold. Maybe she had been living in a dream all along. Maybe this was the moment she had to wake up from. Days passed, and the silence between them stretched longer. She waited, hoping for a call, a message, anything to prove that he still cared. But the phone remained still, a cruel reminder of the distance between them. She spent hours looking at the screen, willing it to light up, but it never did. Her friends noticed the change in her. The way her smile had faded, the way she grew distant from everything that once made her happy. She had always believed in their love, convinced that time and space could never break the bond they shared. But now, doubts crept in, gnawing at her peace. She kept telling herself it was just a rough patch, but the silence was too loud to ignore. Every passing day felt like a blow to her spirit. The warmth she once felt in his words had begun to feel like a distant memory, and each moment without him felt heavier. She had hoped love would be enough, but now, she wondered if it ever truly had been. She wanted to believe things would work out, but her heart ached with the weight of uncertainty. Could love really survive distance, or was she simply fooling herself? Her best friend Sarah had tried to reach out multiple times. She had noticed the change, the way the character seemed to withdraw more with each passing day. "You need to talk to him," Sarah insisted, her voice gentle but firm. "This isn't healthy for you." But the character always dismissed her, putting on a brave face. "It's just a phase," she would say, trying to reassure both Sarah and herself. But, deep down, she knew the truth. Something had shifted, and she could feel it. Still, she couldn't bring herself to reach out. The thought of hearing the wrong words, words that confirmed her worst fears, made her hesitate. She wondered if maybe Sarah was right, that she had been lying to herself for too long. But facing the truth felt like a bigger risk than staying in the uncertain limbo of waiting. She had always been the one to stay hopeful, to trust in love despite the distance. But now, even hope seemed to be fading, and she felt powerless against the reality that seemed to be crashing in on her. A few days later, she finally mustered the courage to call him. Her heart raced as the phone rang, each second stretching into an eternity. He picked up. His voice sounded distant, almost flat, as if he were distracted. "Hey," he said, his tone unsure. "What's up?" Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she couldn't find the words. How could she tell him how much this silence had hurt? How could she explain the weight she had carried all this time, waiting for him to make a move, to show that he cared? Instead, she smiled through the phone, masking the tremor in her voice. "I just wanted to hear your voice," she said, the lie hanging heavy in the air. They talked for a few minutes, the conversation awkward and strained. His words were kind, but there was something off about the way he spoke. It wasn't the same as before. The distance wasn't just physical now. It had seeped into his words, his tone. It was as if she had become a part of his past, something he hadn't fully let go of. She hung up the phone, the conversation lingering in her mind. She had hoped for reassurance, but instead, she was left with more questions than answers. After the call, she sat in silence for hours, the phone still resting on her lap. The conversation replayed in her mind over and over again. She wondered if he had grown tired of her. The reality she had been avoiding was finally starting to sink in. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of them comforting. How could he change so much? How could someone who once made her feel like the most important person in the world become so distant? The silence was unbearable. She wanted to reach out to him again, but she was afraid of pushing him further away. What if he wasn't interested anymore? What if, in his silence, he had already moved on? She tried to busy herself with other things, but nothing seemed to help. Every thought, every minute, was consumed by him, by the uncertainty of what they had become. The love she thought was unbreakable was now fraying at the edges, and she had no idea how to stitch it back together. She woke up the next morning to a text from him. It was simple, just a few words. "I miss you." Her heart sank as she stared at the message. It should have been comforting, but instead it left her more confused than before. Why now? Why, after all the silence, the distance? Had he truly missed her, or was this just another attempt to keep her from moving on? Her hands shook as she typed out a response. "I miss you too," she wrote, but the words felt hollow, like an echo of something that no longer felt the same. She hit send before she could second-guess herself. The message sat there on the screen, unanswered for what felt like hours. Every minute that passed without a reply made the anxiety in her chest grow. She had hoped that this message would offer some clarity, but instead, it only deepened the uncertainty. She realized she couldn't keep doing this, waiting for crumbs of affection. It was clear now that the distance had changed things in ways she hadn't expected. The days had begun to feel like a blur. Calls were less frequent, and when they did happen, they were short and strained. The emotional gap between them seemed to widen with each passing day. She felt herself growing more distant, unable to understand where it all went wrong. He had always been her anchor, but now he seemed like a fleeting memory, slipping away faster than she could hold on. There were moments when she'd catch herself thinking about his voice, his laugh, and the warmth of his words. She would replay their conversations in her head, trying to find a clue, some hint of why things had changed. But there was nothing. Silence had crept in, settling between them like an unspoken truth. What had once been filled with hope now felt hollow. She couldn't bring herself to confront him. The fear of hearing the truth, of knowing that the love they had might not survive the distance, kept her paralyzed. She wanted to reach out, to ask what was happening, but part of her was afraid that even if she did, the answer wouldn't be one she could bear. One evening, as she scrolled through her phone, she saw a post from him. He was out with friends, laughing in a photo that made her chest tighten. She had always been happy to see him happy, but now, it hurt. Why didn't he seem to miss her? Why was he able to move on so easily, while she felt herself falling apart? The image, so casual and carefree, stood in stark contrast to the weight she felt in her heart. It wasn't just the post that stung, but the realization that he might be living a life without her in it. She had always imagined that they would work through the distance, that they would be stronger because of it. But now, she wondered if she had been delusional. Thought of him being happy without her gnawed at her, and jealousy, a feeling she had never associated with their relationship, crept in. Was this what their love had become? A one-sided effort? The more she thought about it, the more her confidence in their future together wavered. She could feel the pull of doubt growing stronger. She couldn't ignore the feeling gnawing at her any longer. The more she thought about his lack of communication, the more it seemed like he was slipping away from her, emotionally and physically. The text messages were brief, the calls were less frequent, and the love she once felt from him had become a distant memory. Her doubts began to mount, and she couldn't suppress them any longer. She sent him a message, hoping it would break the silence, hoping he would finally open up. "Why are we drifting apart?" she typed, her fingers trembling as she pressed send. She sat there, staring at the screen, waiting for a response. Time seemed to stretch as she watched the typing indicator flicker, but the reply never came. The waiting felt endless, and with each passing minute, her anxiety grew. Was he avoiding her? Was he with someone else? Her heart raced, and she felt the weight of the question hang in the air, unanswered. The next day she received a reply. It was short, distant, almost casual. "Sorry, I've been busy. Talk later." The words sent a chill through her. It wasn't just the lack of effort, but the tone. the indifference. She could feel the sting of rejection, of being pushed aside. The message confirmed everything she had feared. He wasn't invested in this relationship anymore. He was living his life, and she was just a footnote. Her hands shook as she set the phone down, a sense of finality settling over her. She knew then that this wasn't just a rough patch, this was the beginning of the end. The thought of losing him, of watching their love fade into nothing, was unbearable. But she couldn't ignore the truth. He had changed, and maybe, just maybe, so had she. That night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to silence the thoughts racing through her mind. What had happened to the love they shared? What had happened to the connection that once felt unbreakable? She remembered the promises they had made, the plans they had talked about, and the dreams they had built together. But now, those dreams felt like empty promises. The fear of moving on, of letting go, was overwhelming. She didn't want to admit that it was over, but she knew in her heart that the love she had been holding on to had already begun to slip away. She had tried to keep things alive, to fight for them, but it seemed like she was fighting alone. She closed her eyes, feeling the tears threaten to fall, but she didn't let them. She wasn't ready to cry yet. Instead, she held on to the hope that one day she would find peace, even if it meant moving on from him. The truth had been hidden for so long, but now it was unavoidable. She had suspected it for weeks, but the confirmation hit harder than she ever imagined. As she scrolled through his social media, her eyes locked onto a post that left her breathless. It wasn't just a photo. It was a story. He was with someone else. The caption was innocuous enough. A simple, good times with great friends, but the intimacy between them was undeniable. The way he looked at her, the way their hands were intertwined, the closeness in their smiles. It was all too much to ignore. Her hands shook as she stared at the screen, her mind racing. Had she been so blind? Had she ignored the signs because she didn't want to face the reality? She replayed every conversation, every moment they had shared, searching for clues that she had missed. But now, everything was clear. The love she thought was so real, so unbreakable, had been shattered without her knowing. Her stomach churned with a mixture of disbelief and hurt. She couldn't breathe. The truth she had feared for so long was finally out in the open. She needed to confront him, to demand the truth, but the thought of hearing it from him, of finally accepting the reality, filled her with dread. Her fingers hovered over the phone, unsure if she should call or send a message. She debated back and forth, but her mind kept racing. What would she even say? How could she confront him about something so raw, so painful? The silence from his side had been deafening, and yet here it was, the truth she had been avoiding. She couldn't put it off any longer. She had to know if he had already moved on, if their love had been nothing more than a fleeting moment. Her heart ached as she thought about the life he might be building without her. And the future they had planned together seemed like a distant, unreachable dream. She swallowed hard, closing her eyes for a moment before taking a deep breath and finally hitting call. The call connected, but the voice on the other end wasn't what she expected. It was cold, detached. There was no warmth, no recognition in his tone. "Hey," he said almost indifferently. She could feel the distance between them, and it wasn't just physical, it was emotional, as if the connection they once shared had already been severed. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the words seemed to get caught in her throat. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but the question felt like a scream. "Why did you hide this from me?" His response was empty, vague, and before she knew it, the conversation had spiraled into confusion and hurt. He tried to explain, to offer excuses, but the truth was clear. There was someone else. She wasn't sure whether it was his indifference or the reality of the situation, but everything felt like it was slipping through her fingers. The life they had built seemed to crumble in that one moment. The conversation ended as abruptly as it began. She sat there, phone still in hand, feeling the weight of everything that had just been revealed. It felt like the world had shifted beneath her feet, and she was left struggling to find her balance. He had been so calm, almost detached, while she was left in a whirlwind of emotions. She tried to process what had just happened, but her mind was a blur of confusion and hurt. The love she had clung to for so long now felt like a lie. She had wanted him to fight for them, to show her that their love was worth saving, but instead, he had made his choice. She wiped her tears trying to steady herself, but the sting of betrayal was too sharp. She wondered how she had missed the signs, how she had been blind to everything happening right under her nose. It hurt more than she could ever put into words, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't keep holding on to something that wasn't real anymore. As the days passed, the truth began to settle in, but the hurt didn't fade. She threw herself into her work, into the things she could control, but nothing seemed to fill the emptiness inside. The truth that he had been seeing someone else, that their future was nothing but a fantasy, gnawed at her every waking moment. There were nights when she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment they had shared. The good memories seemed so distant now, so tainted by the reality of his betrayal. She had tried to hold on to hope, tried to convince herself that things would work out, but now, she understood that hope alone couldn't keep them together. She thought about reaching out to him again, asking for closure, but she knew deep down that it was too late for that. She had to learn to let go, to walk away, but the process of moving on felt like an impossible task. The love she had fought so hard for was slipping through her fingers, and the worst part was knowing that he had already moved on. The confrontation had been inevitable. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, not when her heart felt like it was being ripped apart with each passing day. The text, the call, the silence, they all led to this. When they finally faced each other, everything she had been holding in came rushing out. She demanded the truth, her voice trembling with the weight of her emotions. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but full of raw pain. His eyes were cold, distant, not the man she had once known. He gave her the answers she dreaded, and with each word, her world seemed to crumble. "I didn't want to hurt you," he said, but those words, once comforting, now felt like a hollow excuse. She couldn't help but laugh bitterly at the irony of it all. How could he not see that the betrayal was what truly hurt her? The tears she had been holding back for so long finally spilled, but she wasn't sure if they were tears of anger, heartbreak, or relief. She had needed this closure, but now it felt like the final nail in the coffin of everything they had built together. The silence that followed was suffocating. She could hear the distant sound of birds in the trees, but it felt like they were in a different world, a world she no longer belonged to. "I don't know what to say," he finally muttered, his voice thick with regret. But his apology felt empty, a last-ditch effort to soothe his conscience. She had spent so long convincing herself that they could make it work, but now she realized that the foundation they had built was cracked beyond repair. "There's nothing you can say," she replied, her voice firm, cutting through the tension. She had spent so much time living in the shadows of their relationship, clinging to the hope that he would change. But now, she saw him for who he truly was, someone who had moved on long before she was ready to face it. The weight of it all crushed her, but she knew she had to walk away. There was no more holding on. This was it, the end of something she thought would last forever. As the days passed, she found herself drifting through life like a ghost, walking through the motions without truly being present. The apartment, once filled with memories of their time together, now felt cold and empty. The walls seemed to close in on her as she tried to adjust to the silence. She had always been someone who loved deeply, who believed in the power of love to overcome any obstacle. But now, she wasn't sure if she even remembered who she was without him. She had given so much of herself, but in the end, it hadn't been enough. Her friends, who had always been supportive, now seemed like distant figures in her life, as if they were watching her from behind a glass wall. They told her she was strong, that she would get through this, but she wasn't so sure anymore. The hurt lingered in her chest, gnawing at her, reminding her of what she had lost. She had tried to hold on to him for so long, but now she understood that holding on to the past would only prevent her from healing. One night, as she sat alone in her apartment, her phone buzzed. It was a message from him, a simple, "I miss you." The words felt hollow, distant, as if they were meant to ease his conscience more than to actually express any real emotion. She stared at the message, her heart racing with confusion and anger. How could he miss her now, after everything that had happened? The betrayal, the lies, the distance, all of it came rushing back in a wave of hurt. She wanted to respond, to tell him exactly how she felt, but she couldn't find the words. She had spent so long waiting for him to realize what he had lost, but now she understood that he had already moved on. The message was just another reminder of the one-sided love she had fought so hard to keep alive. She put the phone down, taking a deep breath. She knew what she had to do: move on, let go, and stop waiting for someone who had already let her go. The next day, she found herself standing at the edge of a new beginning. She had decided to take control of her life, to stop letting the past hold her back. The memories of their time together, once so vivid and cherished, now felt like fragments of a dream. She had loved him, but love wasn't enough to keep a relationship alive when both people weren't fully invested. She had given everything to him, but now, she had to give something to herself, her freedom. It wasn't easy to let go, but with each step away from the past, she felt lighter, stronger. She had spent so long searching for closure, but now, she understood that closure was something she had to give herself. She took a deep breath, looking out at the world before her. There was so much more to life, and she was finally ready to embrace it. The weeks following their breakup were the hardest she had ever faced. She spent most of her time at work, keeping herself busy, trying to avoid thinking about him. But no matter how hard she tried, his absence weighed on her. The apartment, once a place of shared laughter and quiet moments, now felt like a hollow shell, a reminder of what she had lost. She walked past places that had once been filled with memories, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she would never return to those moments again. She began to notice the small things, how the sunlight hit the floor just right in the morning, or how quiet the evenings had become. These little details had once been shared, but now they were hers alone. The loneliness was suffocating at times, and though she had started to heal, the wound of losing him was still there, raw and unhealed. She was learning to live with it, to move forward, but she couldn't help but wonder if she would ever feel whole again. Her friends had been trying to reach out, to help her get back to some semblance of normalcy, but each attempt felt like a distant echo. She wanted to be there for them, but every time she saw them laughing together, she was reminded of how much had changed. It wasn't their fault, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place, as if she were an outsider in her own life. She told herself that it would get better, that eventually she would feel like herself again. But the truth was, she wasn't sure who she was anymore. The person she had been in the relationship seemed like a different version of herself, someone who had loved so deeply and unconditionally, but now, she felt like a stranger to that person. She found herself yearning for a time when things were easier, when she could just enjoy the simple moments without the weight of her past hanging over her. She wanted to move on, but part of her still clung to the hope that somehow, things could go back to how they were. One afternoon, as she was scrolling through old messages, a text from him appeared on her screen. It was simple: "I hope you're doing okay." The words hit her like a wave, washing over her with a mixture of confusion and anger. Why now? After everything, after the silence, he was reaching out. She stared at the message for a long time, her mind racing. She thought about how much she had changed in the time since they'd last spoken. She was no longer the person who had waited for his calls, who clung to the hope that things could work out. No, now she was someone different, stronger, more aware of her own worth. And yet, the message still stung. There was no easy way to process the emotions that flooded her. She felt a brief surge of hope, but it was quickly replaced by the realization that responding would only bring back the hurt she was trying so hard to leave behind. She didn't know what to say, so she put her phone down and let it go unanswered. She wasn't ready for the past to resurface. Days later, she finally made the decision to move forward. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't something that happened overnight, but she could feel it. She wasn't going to wait for answers anymore, for apologies that wouldn't come, or for someone who had already moved on. She had spent so much time holding on to a past that no longer existed, and now it was time to embrace the future. It was scary, uncertain, and full of challenges, but she had learned that the only way to heal was to let go. The journey of rediscovery was not easy, but it was necessary. She had to rebuild herself, piece by piece, without the weight of someone else's absence holding her down. She began to take small steps, going to the gym, meeting new people, rediscovering old hobbies. She knew it wouldn't be perfect, but it was hers to rebuild. The first step was letting go of the pain, and she was finally ready to take it. She had come so far, but there were still moments of doubt. She caught herself wondering what he was doing, if he thought about her at all. But those moments were fleeting. She had learned to be her own person again, to rely on herself for happiness and peace. The loneliness that had once been unbearable had become a quiet companion. Something she could live with, something that didn't control her anymore. She realized that she didn't need his closure, his words, or his love to move forward. She was enough, just as she was. The last few months had been painful, but they had also taught her something valuable, that she could survive, even thrive, without the person who once consumed her thoughts. The pain had faded, replaced by strength, and though she would always carry the lessons of her past, she was ready to embrace whatever the future held. A few months had passed since she last heard from him. She was walking through the city, feeling the crisp evening air against her skin when she saw him. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and something stirred within her. His presence was a reminder of everything she had let go of, everything she had worked so hard to forget. The brief interaction felt like the last page of a chapter she thought had ended. Yet, as he smiled and walked away, the ache she had buried deep within her resurfaced. She didn't chase after him, she simply stood still, feeling both stronger and weaker at the same time. He had moved on, and so had she. But in this fleeting moment, they were still tethered by the past. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The past few months had been filled with moments of self-discovery, but his sudden appearance reminded her how deeply he had once affected her. She thought she was beyond this, but the emotions flooded back. It was a mix of regret, longing, and what-ifs. Her heart felt heavy again, but this time she allowed herself to feel it fully. She didn't have to hide from the pain anymore, nor did she have to run toward the hope that things could have been different. It was simply a part of her story now, a chapter she could revisit, but no longer live in. The next morning, she decided to meet a friend for coffee, trying to distract herself from the overwhelming flood of memories. As they sat across from each other, laughing and chatting, she realized how much she had changed. She wasn't the person who waited for a text or clung to the past anymore. She was learning to embrace the present, to find joy in the small moments. She had finally begun to see her worth outside of him, outside of the relationship. The conversation shifted from the past to future plans, and for the first time she felt hopeful again, not for a reunion, but for the life that lay ahead of her. Later, while walking through the park, she caught herself smiling, the weight of the past momentarily forgotten. She had taken so much of the time to heal, but now, she felt ready to embrace life again. She noticed the little things around her, the sound of the leaves rustling, the laughter of children, the fresh air. These simple things, once overlooked, now filled her with peace. The past no longer controlled her. She was ready to explore new possibilities, new connections, and live for herself, not for someone else's memory. As the days passed, she began to feel a quiet peace settling within her. She no longer sought validation from him or anyone else. She had learned to trust herself again, to believe in her strength and resilience. When she thought about him, it was no longer with bitterness but with understanding. He had been a chapter in her life, but not the whole story. And as she closed that chapter, she realized how much room she had made for new beginnings. Life was moving on, and so was she. The future was uncertain, but it was hers to shape.